All right, Bomb Squad, here we are. I want to be the very first person to welcome you to Podcasting Strategy Simplified. I am your host, Jason Sircone, and as your host, who else would be the first person to welcome you to this newly rebranded podcast, right? But here we are. We're back, and as you've probably already figured out, we've got some changes in place. Now, if this is your very first time here, when you go back in the archives, you're going to discover that the first 70 plus episodes of this podcast were known as Let's Blow This Up. And in the last episode, prior to going this new direction with this new intro and this new show name, I explained how that name came to life, why it meant so much to me, and why I've decided to take things in a different direction with this show. Now, when I say different direction, I don't mean a different direction with the content. There's going to be a lot of podcast strategy talk here on the show. And if there wasn't, wow, is the name of false advertisement, right? But overall, I felt this was the right way to go because at Bombtrack Media, I am 100% focused on podcast strategy and helping new podcasters understand what's in front of them as they venture onto this medium for the very first time. Likewise, I am also working with experienced podcasters and helping them hone in that strategy so they can get the most from their efforts. We have a very bad stigma in podcasting where too many people start without that strategy fully vetted out, and the content that they lean into doesn't serve them, or it just doesn't get them off the ground or get their show off the ground, I should say. And ultimately, we have too many people that walk away from their podcast before they've experienced any true breakthroughs. I've said this on the show. If you go back in the archives, you'll hear me say this, that podcasters aspiring, they come into this with a lot of piss and vinegar. They want to make something special. They know they've got a good idea, but there's too many people that start off with just one episode to see what happens. And then when nothing happens, they feel like it won't work and they walk away. Or they get in the trenches and discover that podcasting is not easy. Believe me, there are people out there that will tell you that it's easy, but it's not. There's a lot of levels to this. But overall, the idea behind building a solid strategy for your podcast is to understand all of the moving parts and to get a feel and know what you don't know, because that's coming into podcasting. That's usually how it is. You don't know what you don't know. I want to bring some know into this. And that's what this podcast is all about. If you go back in the archives of this show, I would say over 90% of the content in those episodes, and I say 90% conservatively because if you go back to the very first season, there were a couple episodes that weren't dedicated to podcasting. They were more about branding. But overall, the content you're going to find in the archives of this, when the show was known as Let's Blow This Up, was heavily dedicated to helping you with your podcasting efforts. Going forward, that's exactly what you're going to experience. With the new name, I wanted to have something that was a little bit more on the nose. One of the big things I'm going to talk about going forward is podcast SEO, because that's something that absolutely needs to be part of your strategy. Thinking about that discoverability factor. How are people going to find your podcast and ultimately learn from it? You have to position your show to make that happen. And if you're doing things that put up unseen obstacles that keep people from experiencing your podcast, then you're just going to spin your wheels. So with such a heavy emphasis on strategy, I wanted this podcast to serve as a mechanism that can extol some of the coaching that I do, but also serve as a guide to help you in your own efforts. If you're in DIY mode, my hopes is that what you hear on this podcast are going to help you build your podcast and ultimately feel the rewards of a good, solid, well-curated podcast. Without question, strategy plays a key role in that. And I want to make sure that I use this podcast to lean into that. So as we go forward, you're going to experience a lot of episodes with me sharing tips, strategies, commentary, insights, my thoughts, my opinions, things that I feel are relevant and crucial to how you build your podcast. I'm also going to be welcoming guests onto the show from time to time because I like having those conversations where we can dig into this in a much deeper fashion. And if you go back in the archives in season 3, I did something called the co-host collective on the Let's Blow This Up stream. It was great to connect with some of my colleagues in the podcast space and have deep dive conversations for 30 minutes on various subjects within the podcast space. I'm going to continue doing that here on the show as we move forward. We will still dive in and try to pick apart as many good subjects as we can. There's going to be other extensions of this podcast, such as a live stream where me and my guests will dive into some current events and other big happenings in the podcast space. Stay tuned for information on that because I'll run the audio replays here on the show. If you do go back in the archives, you know that as an audience member, you are part of the Bomb Squad. That will continue. I love having you in the Bomb Squad. I don't want to do away with that name for the audience, so welcome to the Bomb Squad. We have jackets coming. Stay tuned. This show is going to be dedicated to all things podcast strategy. As I said, as it's baked into the title, it would be false advertising if it did not. Starting next week and every Thursday going forward, I'll have new content for you. And sometimes I'll have more than one episode. And that includes the kickoff to Podcasting Strategy Simplified. I'm going to drop 2 episodes for you to help you get acclimated to where this podcast is going. I just recently celebrated my 11-year anniversary in podcasting. So I want to talk about that and share some things that I've learned over that time. And I'm trying to be incredibly articulate with that and not be as just basic as what did you learn in 11 years? Oh, make sure you give value and you stay consistent. No, I want to dive a little bit deeper than that. Also, I want to talk about this rebranding phase that I just went through because as I learned in talking with people, as I moved into this space and then as I started to execute on it, I think this is a subject that doesn't get a lot of press, but it really should, because I think there are some folks out there that are wondering if it's the right move. And they might be contemplating whether they want to go down that road of doing a rebrand on their podcast. But there's sometimes that sunk cost fallacy of I've put so much time and effort into this name. What happens if I change it? There's a number of factors in play that I want to pick apart. So I'm going to talk about that in one of the intro episodes as well. Make sure that you're bookmarked. Make sure that you're following. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube, because this is going to be a damn good resource to help you with your podcast strategy going forward. A big change, obviously, is going from a season-based podcast to a weekly podcast. And that's something that I'll cover in an upcoming episode as well, is making that transition. Because I think that's another thing we get lost in, is we have to do podcasting a certain way. I believe firmly that the way you podcast should be parallel to the season of your life and the time that you have available for doing that podcast. If you try to force it, if you try to push yourself into a position where you're putting out content that's done haphazardly or it's done half-assed, it inevitably will lead to burnout. And that's not going to help anybody. We want to make sure that you're succeeding on this platform. So how do we do that? It all comes back to strategy. So we'll talk about this in upcoming episodes. But I'm glad that you are here. I wanted to take this chance to talk about the new name, introduce what's happening going forward. But going forward, as I said, as I wind this introduction down, we are now known as Podcasting Strategy Simplified. New episodes coming at you every Thursday on YouTube and on your favorite podcast apps. I welcome you to give me feedback. If you like the information that you hear, I've added a Buy Me a Coffee link to the show notes in YouTube and on your favorite podcast player. You're welcome to donate and support my efforts. If not, a simple text message or email or message of any kind, let me know what you learned, will suffice. I appreciate you being a part of the Bomb Squad. And as we move forward with Podcasting Strategy Simplified, I look forward to having you in the audience. So that's going to put a bow on this introduction to Podcasting Strategy Simplified. I'm damn glad you're here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you on the next episode. Until then, stay explosive.